I'm Marina Tabassum. I'm an architect based in Bangladesh. So I run my practice, Marina Tabassum Architects. I'm also a professor at Technical University Delft in the Netherlands. Now I'm here in London. We're finishing up the Serpentine Pavilion. So we've designed the 2025 Serpentine Pavilion.
Hi, I'm Samta Nadeem and I'm the curatorial director at STIR. And I'm extremely pleased to be having this conversation today with Marina, sitting at the venue of the Serpentine Pavilion, the 25th one, which comes 25 years after the first one that was done by Zaha Hadid. Starting with this conversation, the pavilion this time, you've named it a capsule in time, which is actually a capsule that can be unpacked in so many different ways. But specifically for this one, if you can expand upon the idea and where is that coming from?
Right. The pavilion, Serpentine Pavilion, has a certain life in this park, right? Every year it's a new commission. And so it's here from June to October. And basically, the pavilion is there. It's celebrated. Different kind of activities happen in this space, and then after a certain time, then it moves. It goes to a second life or something. But it's gone in the sense that it's again replaced by some other pavilion, and it sort of goes on and on every year. So for me, this is a capsule, almost like the time capsules where it's here now, and it's bringing people in from all different places, from London and also from all around the world, and sort of different kind of activities, people coming in, new moments being created, and this will sort of be in this capsule, and then it will probably have its own life in the virtual realm, but at the same time, it will be sort of gone in a way. So for me, this is that capsule in time, which holds all these memories together.
So, we read it in your concept note how there is something about the fluidity of land,
right.
That you evoke also, not just because it's contextual to where you come from and
right.
where your practice is based, but you also evoke that in the concept of this pavilion.
Mm-hmm.
So could you expand upon how you're doing that?
Well, in Bangladesh, if you know Bangladesh and its landscape and its hydrology, it's a very fluid landscape. It's a delta, and it's constantly reshaping itself in certain parts of the rivers where, all this water that comes down from the Himalayas going into the Bay of Bengal and then to the Indian Ocean. It's basically has this hydrology, which actually has an impact on the way people live their lives. Which is about movement. So as we know, houses or home is always something static, but in our landscape, it's a constant movement for many people. So that mobility we try to address through architecture in many ways for people who are marginalized, who doesn't have a proper way of living or a good, let's say, living condition. So we've tried to address these issues for the last 5 years or so. Through our foundation, through different kind of works, and it just doesn't only focus on houses or architecture, but it's also about generation of economy and different kind of livelihood programs and everything. So in a way, that kind of idea that temporality, or let's say impermanence, which is quite embedded in our landscape. Again, when you come here and design a pavilion, it has that temporality in that sense. So sort of to tie that together was an interesting point, because both are dry construction, where you bring in a certain kind of structural material, you create a structure, and then you can dismantle it and take it away to another venue.
Which is really interesting because, one of the fundamental guidelines of Serpentine Pavilion is that it invites architects who've not built in the UK before.
Right.
And when we heard, of course, about you, we were quite intrigued because your practice is so rooted. And for it to suddenly come, on the British land, which is so different from, from, Bangladesh, of course,
Yeah.
or South Asia largely. And
Yeah.
we were thinking about what could have been like the biggest challenges for you to have to design in a completely new context.
Yeah.
But I mean, other than the fact that you just kind of spoke about the very common thread here, which maybe made sense for you to even accept this.
Yeah, I mean,
commission?
as an architect, I should be able to design anywhere, right? As long as I have the right knowledge and the right information, and I have the actual tools to be able to address and respond to a certain location. So in that sense, and it's a pavilion, it's not really a building in that sense that will shape human life in that sense. It's basically a celebration of, let's say, summer, celebration of parks, some celebration of bringing and coming together of people. So in a way, it has that celebratory element to it. And it wasn't that difficult because all you have to do is, in a way, understand the materials that you can source here, the construction techniques which are much more usable. And I was mentioning about the material which are allowed, which are not, and so staying to the regulation. Those things we had to understand, of course, since I'm not from here, I haven't built here before. But at the same time, I think understanding the location in the sense that its proximity to the gallery, Serpentine Gallery, and then being in the Kensington Garden, and the garden is celebrated actually by a lot of people who comes to the parks, and how you can bring in the park into the pavilion, and the pavilion becomes a part of the park, was basically our main agenda to look into and to find a solution to that.
And also the pivoting of this one tree right in the center.
Yeah.
I mean, you could have decided to place that tree anywhere. It could have been in the corner.
Yeah.
Why did you choose the center?
I find center to be a very important part. Like, even in our Indian subcontinent, every house has a courtyard. And the courtyard is sort of the center of a household. And that is the space where everything happens. So for me, this is a sort of an abstract interpretation of a courtyard. And then the tree actually brings in life. It's sort of the only living and the life element into that space, other than the people who will be in that space. But otherwise, I think, that gives you that sense of life and also that center. Quite often, Frida, who I also designed, I remember once I did a talk with her, and then she said, every project that you design has a belly button. Mm-hmm. So I think this is the belly button of this project.
One of the other things that we were curious about when we saw the initial sketches are some of your most celebrated works outside of Bangladesh, which probably the rest of the world sees very often, through pictures, photography, features. It does have a lot of usage of brick as a material. So could you talk about when you were invited to do this commission, why did you choose the materials that you chose and maybe not the brick, which is quite an identifier of your work?
Well, the brick is a much more of a permanent material, right? So it's always associated with permanence, staticness, being somewhere, and the pavilion is a much more temporality. It deals with more temporary space. So we went for a dry construction, and for the dry construction, we thought that wooden structure and a lighter material, which would require less foundation, would be helpful. And the foundation is reused. So as you know, that the foundation that here we are using has already been used before in other pavilions. So I think those are also important factors when you're designing here, that it needs to be a sustainable approach, and that even we could have built with brick, then how do you then dismantle it and take it elsewhere? So all those factors we had to keep in mind. And so instead of going for more towards our more permanent buildings, we opted for the way we design our temporary structures.
There is a word, I mean, there are two key terms that have come up quite a bit in the responses that you've given us already. But there is no way that we can't be having this conversation and not specifically speak about the dichotomy of permanence and impermanence. And also the way that, people normally think of architecture. Because at its very core, it's about providing shelter, and you do kind of think of permanence. But in landscapes like, the delta, the Bangladeshi delta, which is where we're talking about the river shifting and moving people constantly, and it is a way of life. So probably people who come from there, when they think of architecture, they don't necessarily think being rooted in one place, or being permanent, so to say, so much. So in that sense, again, between a pavilion, which we know is meant for a short period of time, versus projects that you have been doing, especially since the 2020, the projects that you have been doing to rehabilitate people, in those parts of the land. How do you kind of grapple between this idea of permanence and impermanence, and the similarity or the difference between, somebody's home versus a pavilion?
Yeah, I mean, they're two different typology for sure, so they have to be addressed differently. But at the same time, I think the structures that we build, especially in the chores or in the sandbeds, are for people who has to move because of the way the whole land and water dynamics works in that area. But at the same time, I think this notion of wanting to be rooted is there. I wouldn't say that it's not there, but it's sort of compelling them to move constantly because of that other reason. I remember going to a place and then I said, "Why don't you plant some bamboo tree around your house so that the house doesn't get too hot?" And then he just told me, "I moved 15 times in my lifetime." So planting a tree, which would take another, let's say, 2-3 years or even 5 years, is not a projection that they do in that location, because it's immediate. Every day is now. And then what happens the next day, they don't know. So it's a very different way of living and understanding, which we, coming from a city or, who has never really faced this, would ever understand. So for us, the last 5 years has been a constant learning process. Learning from people, learning the way people live their lives. So it's one way rewarding, but it's also looking at architecture from a different perspective also. So I think that's, for me, is very important in a way when we do these projects. And for pavilion, it's something completely different. It's probably, it's a temporary structure, but at the same time, you're celebrating. It's celebration. It's not survival. So there is a difference. Whereas in the houses that we build, it's about minimal materials so that it's easy to build, easy to take away. Here in that case, you don't have that. So it's in a way a celebration of architecture, I would say, which is important for sure. That's the commission here in the Serpentine. And for me, it was also kind of interesting to bring these two together, because I have also worked with designing mosques, designing museums, community spaces, where I really love to work with space and form and light and ventilation. That's something I aspire to do as well. And then that is, again, another form of architecture. So in this case, here in the Serpentine, you bring in temporariness, or let's say the dry construction of temporality, but at the same time, the temporality has a certain kind of presence in terms of its space, its quality of light, and hopefully it's a nice marriage between the two.
Referencing the structures that you have designed, the kuribari, I was also reading about how those are being kind of adapted across the country now because of
I wouldn't say that yet, because we know so far we have kept it within a few certain locations where we built together with the communities. And in those areas, like in the sandbeds where we've built, there we see there's a huge demand for those who hasn't really have a kuribari. So we had to, we worked with Grant. And because we were working with Grant, we had to minimize the number of houses that we could build in a certain location. We wanted to create a community, but at the same time, we were not able to give to everybody in that village. Let's say in a village, if there are 50 families, we probably provided 20 of them. So then the rest of them, when they see that there is a use of this house, they now want one. But we don't have the fund for it. So at the moment, we are trying to create an ecology where we are helping people to create a certain kind of economy among themselves so that they're able to make it on their own. And then also making these different elements available to them so that they are able to then have their resources to be able to bring it together and make the houses. So hopefully, once we do that, if you can create an ecology of its own, hopefully there will be a possibility that it will be taken on by other parts of the country where they have flooding and also this movement of the house.
Right. I was actually also driven towards asking you this connection between you teach in Europe while you practice so much largely within Bangladesh.
Right.
And I mean, all of Europe is also going through a lot of flooding because of the climate sort of impact that's happening. And I was just and the grant I believe that you received for this also comes from Europe.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, is there also like a flux in the different direction in terms of this knowledge that is being created originally for Dhaka or Bangladesh, and that being kind of be useful tomorrow for a completely different region like Europe?
I'm sure it can happen. It doesn't have to be a kuribari in Europe, but the notion that you have to address these issues and there is a certain process of addressing it that can be adapted and then appropriated in its own location based on the material that's available, the construction techniques, and also the people you're building it for and their culture and the climate and everything. So there is always a possibility of taking one example and then appropriating it in a different location. And I hope that's done because I teach in Europe for sure, but then my students are quite often traveling to Bangladesh or in that region, and we focus on issues which are much more pressing of our time in that sense, flooding and climate crisis, or large scale cyclones that's happening more predominantly these days. Housing crisis, disparity of the different conditions where people live their lives. So all these are issues that are very much of our time, and the students are exposed to that reality, which quite often the European students don't get to see. So in a way, to expose them to that, not to pity or to say that you are the savior of these people, but to kind of understand the situation and how people are trying to live through it, or what are the solutions that you can learn and also can think of providing in a certain way. But also at the same time, when you take that knowledge back to your own location, you have that ability to then create something through the process that you've seen or learned, and be more useful to the society where you're trying to serve.
Coming back to probably a happier reference, when we think of the word shamiyana, which is something that you've referenced when talking about this pavilion, we do mostly think of happy things. So it's weddings, or it's parties, or it's religious sort of, celebrations of some kind. So in that sense, taking something which is, shamiyana is not a tent. The two words mean something very different emotionally, but also visually.
Absolutely.
And so when we're talking about a shamiyana, to bring a shamiyana and its reference or its understanding from South Asia, and then to, in a way, put that in the center of a British summer garden. There is definitely this idea of the human nature and the human will to congregate around some things and gather and pool. But what, according to you, is the common thread when you bring the shamiyana, all the way here?
Well, for me, the shamiyana reference is, being in that spaces. Nowadays, you don't see that so much in the cities because now it's much more air-conditioned spaces. But in our earlier years when we were young, remembering going to weddings in these large spaces, quite beautiful, decorative, and then, quite nicely decorated for weddings. But at the same time, I've always been very intrigued by light. And for me, that light that comes through the cloth and then creates a beautiful ambience, and it could be the colored light. If it's a green tent, then you get a nice green light, or if it's an orange one, then you have this beautiful orangey tone into that space. It was quite beautiful, and I thought, shamiyana in a way is that temporary structure where you have these gatherings and different kind of happy moments. And in a way, the Serpentine Pavilion is also celebrating happiness and happy moments to some extent. And so I was thinking that what can I bring from my own location, from my own background to here, which would reference that happiness and that moment of being together under a space and that light. And so that's how I try to reference it. And definitely it's not a shamiyana, what you'll see. It's much more an architecture. But the light, hopefully, that will come through the material that we have chosen, and the colored lights, hopefully will bring that sense and sensibility of being under that space. So in a way, it's an abstract representation. I wouldn't say that you would get a shamiyana, but it would be an abstract representation of that sense and sensibility that I have in my memory.
In this question, I'm going to actually reference another work as well. When we're talking about shifting landscapes, and because of which people have to shift the very idea of their home, of what they call home, or where they build a home. Right. It is in a way almost like not just a natural occurrence, but also a natural response to how your surroundings change or shift. Right. Toshin Oshinovo, when she was doing the Sharjah Architecture Triennale, right, she referenced to these kasbahs, which also again have this sense of movement and impermanence in the way that people live in those environments. Right. And she kind of references to that as a more, let's say, a sustainable way of being. Okay. Do you also, because yours is a very different context, but maybe a similar sort of movement, or do you relate to that at all?
I mean, I could relate to that in the sense that, if I say the difference between the Dutch landscape and Bangladeshi landscape, let's say, we are both deltas, to some extent very close to the sea levels. And in our part of the world, because of the enormous scale of water that comes down from the Himalayas, which is quite a large amount, but at the same time, the rain and the monsoon and everything, and the fragility of the soil, we never try to engineer it. And even if any kind of engineering activity actually failed, because it's impossible to contain that amount of water and that fragility of the land. But in the Dutch context, they have tried to engineer it, and they have engineered it quite successfully. And you see that. But then now, with the sea level rise, as things are becoming more difficult and they're rising above the level, or at least anticipated that the level will increase higher than the dams that has been created, they now are looking into how people in our landscape actually survive through negotiation with land and water, and creating a resilience with which people are sort of trying to live with nature rather than confronting it or trying to engineer it or discipline it in however way you want to put it. And now a lot of these knowledge and a lot of these way of living is being incorporated in the deltas of the Netherlands, and they call it room for the river, let's say, and which we had always, like floodplains, and we keep these spaces empty for the water to inflate and then reduce. So you have to give it enough space, and I think those things are important learnings, and I think that in a way is something that that people can actually learn, that how you don't always have to have a sort of how do you call it, hand, or let's say trying to tame it, tame nature in that sense. Rather let it be, and you also try to create a way of living which is around that.
Yeah, because probably there's also a nuanced difference between adaptability and responsiveness.
Right.
And maybe there is more movement and displacement when we are trying to be responsive, and just to kind of keep that tolerance within the way that we build is what needs to.
Yeah, I mean, when you are moving from one sandbed to another sandbed, I don't call it displacement. It's a way of living. It's a sort of way of living that people are maybe in one sandbed, then they're moving to the next one because that probably erodes, and then they
could come back to the previous one again.
Yeah, and then if it re-emerges, then they come back to that again. But if it doesn't emerge, if it sort of washes away, then they move to another land. But displacement is when you uproot them entirely and move them to a city or somewhere where they do not know how to live their lives, and they change their profession and then become something completely different. And, so that's what displacement is. Displacement is also, of course, internal when people move due to large pressure of livelihood or anything in that sense. Also cross borders. So I think I wouldn't really call this a displacement. It's more a sort of a system of living. Yeah.
There is a lot of course, conversation, not just in the global south, but even in the West about decolonization, and even within architecture, decolonization. But a few years ago, I was hearing this lecture from Yasmin Lari, and we were looking at that when there were floods in Pakistan, which kind of, drowned almost 1/3 of the country. She also came up with a response where she had two guiding factors. One was decarbonization, and the second was decolonization in the way the work is done to kind of help people in times of natural conflicts like this. And one of the things that she spoke about, which stayed with me, was that typically the response to a calamity is that we try and help people. So we give them things.
Exactly.
There is almost this sense of charity in that giving.
Absolutely.
But not this intention of building agency.
Absolutely.
And you build agency when instead of just giving something to them as charity, you basically empower people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And in that sense, I was just thinking that, because again, going back to these references that we were talking about, today we are not just talking about decoloniality in the global south and also the South Asia, but we are also talking about decoloniality in the times of extreme climate impact that is being seen, witnessed, experienced almost every single day by a large set of people. So in that sense, what do you think about when you think about the word decolonial in the practice that you do, which is architecture? How do you deal with that, and what is your response?
Well, first of all, the response should come from us, the locals, right? We who practice in our own landscape, we know the problems, we know the way people live their lives. Even though, and many times there is a certain disconnect also between the people who are living in a certain location and then we who grew up in the cities. In a way, we are colonized also in our mentality. But at the same time, I think I totally agree with this whole notion of empowering people. And the way we do our projects are quite similar, where we do not push anything onto people. We do not give anything for free. I don't believe in giving things for free at all. And that's something we have decided to do from the very start of our foundation and the way we work with people. It's always about partnership. It's always about working together, building together, so that there is a sense of ownership. There is a certain sense of dignity in however way you do things with them. And the thing is, it's not them and us, it's us. At the end of the day, we are the people. We know our problems. And at the end, nobody else will solve it. You have to have your own solution. And the only way to solve it is to be there in the location, to be with them, and then to understand the problems and to resolve it. And quite often the colonial system is that you go there, you try to save them, and pushing your own idea onto people, whether they are, whether that's culturally appropriate or not, you think that's the right answer, and you just think that people should accept it as a right answer. But that's not how it's done, absolutely. And then that's why the sustainability part comes in, because that is never a sustainable process. If you want things to be sustainable and has a longer lasting impact, then it has to come from the people, and you need to be there as an enabler to help them create their own environment in their own understanding and the knowledge that they hold. The first thing to understand is to respect people and to know that they have all the answers. It's just that probably they don't have the means or the right way of connecting things together. So that's where I think we need to put our minds together.
So, what I read really beautifully from that response, maybe in a gist, is you're decolonizing in a way by removing that distance between us and them in the equation. And maybe that really helps to have that impact on the ground.
Absolutely, yeah.
In one of your initial notes about the Serpentine Pavilion, you said that architecture is a way of leaving behind legacies.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is really interesting. Could you expand on that answer?
Yeah, interesting question. Well, I think I referenced it in the sense that, architects as us as architects, when we design something, we expect a continuity of whatever we are designing, that it will have a much larger, longer presence even when we are not there. So it sort of creates a continuity even when we are not present anymore in this world. And that's something, I think it's an aspiration for all architects. That's why we try to build buildings which has that capacity to address this continuity and this timelessness of architecture. For me, being so closely seeing Louis Kahn's building and being so inspired by it, and Kahn has always addressed this issue of continuity and in terms of timelessness. So that agenda has always been there in architecture, and I would say that that's an important part for sure, but that's not the only thing. And how I would like to leave behind my legacy, I don't know if I would even want to leave behind a legacy. I don't want to even be remembered in that sense. I think as long as I'm here on this earth, if I can do something which really helps people, or at least whatever knowledge and experience that I have gathered is able to sort of be a tool to a better living and a better environment. If that is the minimum I can leave behind, that would be my legacy, I would say.